Family Beyond Everything. Written and published by Rising Audiobook. Introduction. There comes a moment in life when everything you spent years building suddenly feels meaningless. The money in your account cannot comfort you. The applause fades. The successful image you created for the world becomes powerless the moment pain enters your life. And that is usually when the painful truth reveals itself. Many people love your success, but very few truly love you. When life becomes difficult, people slowly disappear. Calls become shorter. Messages stop coming. Promises lose their meaning. But somewhere in the middle of that silence, there are still a few people who remain beside you, not because you are successful, useful, or important, but simply because you are family. This audiobook is not about perfect families. It is about the people who stay when life stops being easy. It is about sacrifice no one notices, love that is rarely spoken aloud, and the invisible emotional shelter family provides during life's darkest seasons. Stay with me until the end, because you may discover that the greatest wealth in your life has been beside you all along. Let's start. Chapter 1. The Illusion of Having Everything. There is a dangerous lie many people spend their entire lives believing. It is the idea that success will eventually fill every empty space inside them. That one day, after enough money, recognition, and achievement, they will finally feel complete. So people run. They run toward promotions, bigger houses, expensive cars, social approval, and public admiration. They sacrifice sleep, relationships, peace, and sometimes even their health, just to reach a version of success they imagined would save them from emptiness. Society encourages this chase from childhood. People are praised for being productive, ambitious, and financially successful. But almost nobody teaches them how to stay emotionally connected to the people who truly matter. And that is where the illusion begins, because achievement can impress the world while quietly destroying the person achieving it. A man may sit inside a luxurious office while feeling emotionally exhausted. A woman may build a successful career while secretly feeling isolated every night when she returns home. Someone may have thousands of followers online and still feel like nobody truly understands them. Outward success can create the appearance of a fulfilled life while hiding deep emotional loneliness underneath it. The problem is not success itself. Success is not evil. Building a better life matters. Providing for yourself and your family matters. Growth matters. But many people slowly begin replacing connection with achievement. They become so focused on building a life that they forget the people they originally wanted to build it for. And life has a painful way of revealing that mistake. There are moments when the applause disappears. Moments when money cannot protect you from heartbreak, illness, failure, or emotional collapse. In those moments, people suddenly realize something shocking. Success can attract attention, but it cannot replace genuine human connection. I once heard a story about a wealthy businessman who spent over 30 years building his empire. He owned properties in different cities, traveled in luxury, and was respected by thousands of employees. People admired his discipline and ambition. From the outside, his life looked perfect. But one evening, he suffered a serious health problem and ended up alone in a hospital room. For the first time in years, the meeting stopped. The phone became quiet. Business partners sent polite messages. Employees expressed concern. But very few people actually came to sit beside him. Hour after hour, the room remained silent. And then, late at night, an elderly woman slowly walked into the room. It was his mother. She sat beside him without giving speeches, without asking questions, without caring about his wealth or status. She simply held his hand the way she did when he was a child. And in that moment, the successful businessman realized something painful. He had spent years building an empire while neglecting the relationships that gave life emotional meaning. Many people discover the value of family only after losing something important. Sometimes it happens after financial failure, sometimes after divorce, sometimes after burnout, loneliness, or tragedy. Pain removes illusions. It exposes what truly matters. The people who remain beside you during your weakest moments are usually not the people impressed by your success. They are the people connected to your heart. Family does not care about your image as much as the world does. Family sees you beyond performance, beyond status, beyond achievement. That is why family becomes most valuable when life becomes hardest. Yet modern society constantly pushes people toward emotional disconnection. People are encouraged to compete, compare, and constantly chase more. More money, more recognition, more validation. But very few stop and ask themselves an important question. What is the purpose of success if there is nobody meaningful to share it with? Some people reach the top of their careers only to realize they missed birthdays, ignored conversations, abandoned relationships, and slowly became strangers inside their own homes. They spent years trying to provide financially while becoming emotionally unavailable. And unfortunately, many realize this too late. This chapter is not asking you to reject ambition. It is asking you to remember balance. Build success, but do not lose your people while building it. Earn money, but do not become emotionally bankrupt in the process. Chase your goals, but stay connected to the people who would still love you even if those goals disappeared tomorrow. Because in the end, life becomes very simple. When the noise fades, when failure arrives, when age weakens the body, and when difficult seasons appear, the people who truly matter are rarely the ones who applauded your success. They are the ones who stayed beside you without needing a reason. Chapter 2. When Life Falls Apart. Most people believe they understand loyalty when life is going well. But the truth is, loyalty is easy during comfort. Almost anyone can stand beside you when you are successful, confident, healthy, and useful. People enjoy being around happiness, momentum, and achievement. They answer calls quickly when your life looks exciting. They celebrate you when you are winning. But hardship changes everything. Failure has a strange way of making the room quieter. Messages become shorter. Invitations disappear. Some people slowly create distance without explanation. Others remain physically present, but emotionally absent. And during those painful moments, life reveals a truth many people spend years avoiding. Not everyone who walks beside you is meant to stay beside you. Difficult seasons expose the difference between temporary people and permanent bonds. This is why pain changes people so deeply, not only because of the suffering itself, but because hardship removes illusions. It forces people to see relationships clearly for the first time. Crisis acts like a mirror. It reveals who truly cares and who only enjoyed the version of you that seemed successful, useful, or emotionally easy to handle. There was a young man named Joseph who believed he had built a strong life for himself. He moved to a large city, found a respected job, surrounded himself with ambitious friends, and spent years trying to prove that he no longer needed anyone's help. Independence became part of his identity. He wanted success badly because he believed success would finally make him feel valuable. At first, everything seemed to work. His social circle grew larger. People praised his lifestyle. Photos of expensive restaurants, business meetings, and weekend trips filled his social media. From the outside, he looked confident and unstoppable, but slowly, life began collapsing in ways he never expected. His company went through financial problems, and he lost his job unexpectedly. A relationship he trusted ended almost immediately after his situation changed. Bills began piling up. His confidence disappeared faster than he imagined possible. The same people who once constantly invited him suddenly became busy. Calls were ignored, messages remained unanswered. The loneliness shocked him more than the failure itself. One night, after months of struggling silently, Arif packed his remaining clothes into 2 bags and returned to his childhood home. During the bus ride, shame sat heavily inside him. He felt embarrassed. He believed returning home meant he had failed completely. He expected disappointment when he arrived. Instead, his mother opened the door and hugged him tightly before he could even explain anything. No lecture, no humiliation, no questions about money or status. His father quietly carried his bags inside the house. as if nothing needed to be said. Later that night they sat together eating a simple meal while his mother talked about ordinary things just to make him feel comfortable again. And for the first time in months, Arif felt safe. That safety mattered more than advice, more than money, more than solutions. Because when people are emotionally broken, they are not always searching for answers first. Sometimes they are searching for a place where they can fall apart without being abandoned. That is one of the deepest meanings of family. Family becomes the place where masks are no longer necessary. The world often demands performance. It expects confidence, productivity, strength, and constant progress. But inside a healthy family environment, people are allowed to be human, allowed to fail, allowed to feel weak without losing their worth. Modern culture often glorifies self-sufficiency to an unhealthy degree. People are taught to handle everything alone, to never appear vulnerable, to constantly prove independence. But human beings were never designed to survive emotional pain completely alone. Even the strongest individuals need emotional shelter during difficult seasons, and emotional support is one of the most underestimated forms of strength in the world. A supportive conversation during depression can matter more than financial success. A caring presence during illness can matter more than luxury. A family member quietly sitting beside you during heartbreak can provide more healing than motivational speeches ever could. Pain changes priorities. When life falls apart, people rarely think about impressing strangers. They think about comfort, connection, understanding, and emotional safety. They begin valuing the people who remain present instead of the people who only appeared during success. This does not mean family relationships are always perfect. Some families struggle with misunderstandings, emotional distance, or unresolved pain. But even imperfect families often contain something powerful, a deeper level of unconditional connection than the outside world usually offers. The world is often transactional. Many relationships survive only while benefits exist, but true family love continues during seasons when there is nothing impressive left to offer. That kind of love becomes life-saving during moments of collapse. Some listeners may be going through difficult seasons right now. Maybe life did not unfold the way you planned. Maybe you lost something important. Maybe people you trusted disappeared when you needed them most. Maybe you feel emotionally exhausted trying to hold yourself together. If that is true, remember this carefully. Your hardest season is not always revealing your weakness. Sometimes it is revealing your real people. And that discovery, painful as it may feel, can completely change your understanding of life. Because eventually, most people realize that success alone is not enough to carry the human heart. Achievement may build comfort, but connection builds emotional survival. During life's darkest moments, people rarely remember who admired them. They remember who stayed. The people who answer late-night calls, the people who sit beside you in silence, the people who love you when your confidence disappears, the people who remind you that failure does not erase your value. Those are the people who become home. And sometimes, when everything else falls apart, family becomes the last safe place where a broken person can slowly learn how to stand again. Chapter 3. Family during your hardest times. There is a strange truth about life that most people only understand when everything starts to break down. As long as things are going well, you believe you are surrounded by people. Messages come in quickly, calls feel warm, even casual friendships feel strong. At work you are needed. In society, you are respected. Your presence seems important everywhere you go. But when life turns heavy, when failure arrives without warning, when health declines, when money stops flowing the way it used to, something quietly changes. The crowd becomes smaller. Not everyone stays, not everyone checks in, not everyone has time anymore. And in that shrinking world, something very different begins to appear. Family does not announce itself loudly. It does not make promises it cannot keep. It does not show up with conditions or expectations. It simply stays present in ways that are often silent, but deeply real. It is the mother who notices your silence before you say a word. It is the father who may not express much, but sits beside you when the world feels too heavy. It is the wife who understands your stress without needing a full explanation. It is the child who continues to look at you the same way, even when you feel like you are falling apart inside. Family does not always fix the problem, but it changes something more important. It changes how alone you feel inside the problem, and that difference is everything. Because there is a kind of support the world gives that depends on your performance. When you succeed, you are praised. When you fail, you are questioned. When you are useful, you are valued. When you are not, you slowly become invisible. But family support does not work on that system. It is not built on achievement. It is not built on status. It is not even built on constant agreement. It is built on belonging. That is why, in your hardest moments, family feels different. You do not have to explain yourself perfectly. You do not have to present your life in a polished way. You do not need to prove that you are still worthy of care. You are simply accepted as you are, even when you are not at your best. And that kind of acceptance begins to repair something inside a person that success never truly heals, because professional respect can disappear with one mistake. Social approval can fade with one failure. Even friendships can become distant when life becomes inconvenient. But family, in its deeper form, does not measure your worth by your current condition. It measures your presence in their life as something permanent. In difficult moments, this becomes painfully clear. A man who once felt powerful in meetings may suddenly feel small in his own home, not because he is less respected there, but because respect is no longer the main thing being offered. What is offered instead is something softer, something quieter, something stronger, in a different way, care without performance. And for someone who has spent years trying to prove himself to the world, this shift can feel unfamiliar at first, because the world teaches you to earn everything, but family, in its purest form, teaches you something very different. You are still worthy, even when you are not earning anything at all. This is where emotional healing often begins. Not in success, not in achievement, but in the simple presence of people who refuse to leave when things become difficult. There are moments in life when words fail, when explanations are unnecessary, when advice does not matter. In those moments, a quiet dinner at home, a familiar voice in the background, or even the simple act of someone sitting near you without asking anything can carry more emotional weight than any motivational speech ever could. Because presence speaks a language that pressure cannot understand. And slowly, something begins to shift inside a person going through hardship. The belief that they must carry everything alone starts to weaken. The idea that failure defines them starts to lose power. The feeling of being completely disconnected from life begins to soften. Not because the problem disappears, but because they are no longer facing it alone. That is the hidden strength of family during hardship. It does not erase pain, but it makes pain survivable. It does not remove struggle, but it removes isolation from struggle. And in many cases, that is what truly rebuilds a person. Over time, even broken relationships within a family begin to change during difficult periods. The arguments that once felt important suddenly lose meaning. The distance that once felt permanent starts to shrink, because shared pain has a way of dissolving ego. When life becomes fragile, people stop trying to win against each other and start trying to stand with each other again. That is when healing begins, not through grand apologies or perfect conversations, but through simple presence, repeated day after day, sitting together, eating together, listening without interrupting, staying without leaving. And slowly, what was once just a household begins to feel like something deeper again. A place where you are not measured, not compared, not replaced. A place where you are still yours, even when everything else feels lost. Because in the hardest moments of life, family does not always have answers, but it always has something more powerful. It has remaining. Chapter 4. The regret of I'll spend time later. There is a sentence people repeat so often that it starts to sound harmless. I'll spend time with them later. It feels reasonable in the moment. Work is demanding. Deadlines are waiting, responsibilities are growing. Life appears to be in a phase where sacrifice is necessary, and family time feels like something that can be postponed without consequence. Later becomes the quiet promise that justifies everything else. But life does not keep promises the way people do. At first, nothing feels wrong. You miss one dinner, then another. A weekend becomes busy. A holiday gets replaced with urgency. You tell yourself it is temporary. You tell yourself it is for them, for the future, for stability. And because the intention feels good, the delay feels acceptable. But family life does not pause when you are busy. It continues moving forward quietly, without asking for permission. Children grow, moments pass. Conversations fade into memory before they were fully lived. And slowly, without dramatic warning, the distance between "I'll do it later" and "I wish I had done it earlier" begins to shrink. There is a moment in many lives when this truth becomes unavoidable. It does not arrive loudly. It does not announce itself with anger or blame. It arrives quietly, often when everything else becomes still. A man might find himself alone one evening, scrolling through old photos or videos on his phone, not searching for anything in particular, just looking, remembering, drifting through fragments of a life he once lived but did not fully notice at the time. And then it happens. A birthday video appears. A school function he did not attend. A moment where his child looked toward the camera with excitement, searching for a familiar face in the crowd that was not there. He watches it once, then again, not because he missed the event, but because he is trying to understand how it became something from the past so quickly. The realization is not loud, but it is heavy. Time did not stop waiting. The child in the video is smaller, younger, more innocent than he remembers. But in reality, that version of his child no longer exists. That moment is gone, not lost, but completed. And what remains is only memory. This is where regret begins. Not in failure, not in loss of money or opportunity, but in the quiet understanding that presence was replaced by postponement for too long. People often believe they are building a future for their family by sacrificing the present. They work longer hours, accept more responsibility, chase more income, and tell themselves that all of it is temporary. The goal, they believe, is to give their family a better life later. But what is often forgotten is that family does not only need a better future, it needs a present that is lived together. Because children do not experience life in long-term plans. They experience it in moments, in bedtime stories, in shared meals, in simple walks, in small conversations that feel insignificant to adults but become emotional anchors in memory. And while adults are busy building security, children are quietly building memories. There is a painful mismatch here that most people only realize later. By the time financial stability is achieved, emotional time has already been spent elsewhere. The house may be more comfortable, but the years when connection mattered most have already passed. This is not something people notice while it is happening. Because life gives a convincing illusion, there will always be more time. Another birthday will come, another holiday will arrive, another weekend will open up, another opportunity will appear. But time does not repeat itself in the same form. It moves forward, not backward. The child who once waited at the door for you to come home from work eventually stops waiting, not because love disappears, but because expectation adapts to reality. The excitement of seeing you becomes less frequent, not out of indifference, but out of learned understanding. And that is where regret slowly starts to take shape. Not from what was done, but from what was delayed too often. There is a specific kind of silence that grows inside a home when presence is missing for too long. It is not conflict. It is not anger. It is emotional distance that forms quietly between people who still live under the same roof. Conversations become shorter. Shared laughter becomes rare. Everyone becomes more independent emotionally, not because they want to be distant, but because they had to adapt. And when a parent finally slows down enough to notice, it feels like waking up inside a life that continued without them. The most painful realization is not that time was wasted. It is that time was experienced by others without you being part of it. This is where memories become powerful in a different way. A father may sit alone and realize that the most important parts of his child's childhood were not missing entirely. They were simply not witnessed closely enough to be fully stored in his own memory. And now, no matter how much he wants to return, he cannot step back into those moments. He can only observe them from a distance, like someone watching a life he once had access to. The emotional weight of this realization is difficult to describe. It is not guilt in the traditional sense. It is awareness mixed with helplessness. The understanding that effort in the present cannot fully restore absence in the past. A missed school performance cannot be reattended. A childhood phase cannot be replayed. A conversation that never happened cannot be recovered in its original emotional form. Time does not negotiate, but it teaches. And what it teaches, often painfully, is that presence is not something that can be scheduled indefinitely. It is either given in real time, or it slowly becomes something you only think about later. There are moments when this truth becomes especially clear, when a child no longer asks you to join them as often as before, when your absence becomes part of their expectation, when your presence becomes occasional instead of natural. And in those moments, something shifts internally, not immediately, not dramatically, but deeply. A realization forms that no amount of future success can fully replace the years that were experienced without shared attention, because family does not measure love in future intentions. It measures love in lived moments. This is why regret around time with family feels different from other regrets. It is not about failure in achievement. It is about emotional absence during irreplaceable years. And once a person sees this clearly, they begin to understand something that cannot be unlearned. Time is not something you manage later. It is something you live now, because later always arrives differently than expected. And when it does not bring back what was postponed. It only reveals what was missed. And in that realization, many begin to see family not as something that waits for attention, but as something that quietly lives in the present, whether we are there for it or not. Chapter 5. The silent distance inside modern families. There is a kind of distance that does not begin with conflict. It does not begin with anger, betrayal, or any dramatic event that people can clearly point to. It begins quietly, almost invisibly, inside ordinary days that look perfectly normal from the outside. A home still functions. People still eat together, still share the same roof, still follow the same routines. But something changes beneath the surface. Something harder to notice than absence, because it happens even when everyone is physically present. It is the slow fading of emotional presence, while physical presence remains intact. Modern life has a strange way of filling every moment. Work does not end at the office anymore. It follows people home through phones, messages, notifications, and unfinished mental lists. Even when someone sits at the dinner table, part of their attention is still somewhere else. Tomorrow's meeting, today's stress, unfinished responsibilities. And slowly, without anyone deciding it consciously, attention becomes fragmented. Conversations become shorter, not because there is nothing to say, but because there is less mental space to say it. People start speaking in updates instead of emotions. I'm busy. I'm tired. Everything is fine. These sentences begin to replace real communication, and no one immediately notices that emotional depth is being quietly replaced by functional exchange. Inside many families, technology adds another layer to this distance. Screens sit between people who are sitting in the same room. Each person enters a different world while sharing the same physical space. A father scrolls through work emails, a mother checks messages, a child moves between videos and games. Everyone is connected to something, but not necessarily to each other. It creates an unusual illusion. The family is together, yet emotionally scattered. The home is full, but the connection inside it feels thin. And because this change is gradual, it does not feel like loss at first. It feels like normal life. What makes this distance even more powerful is that it does not arrive with discomfort, it arrives with routine. People adapt to it without resistance. Silence becomes familiar. Meals without conversation become normal. Sitting together without truly engaging becomes accepted. There is no clear moment when warmth disappears. It simply becomes less frequent until it is no longer expected. And once warmth is no longer expected, its absence stops feeling unusual. That is how emotional distance stabilizes inside modern homes, not through conflict, but through adaptation. Stress plays its own silent role in this transformation. A mind that is constantly under pressure begins to prioritize survival over connection. Emotional availability requires energy, and when energy is depleted by work, responsibility, and mental overload, people naturally withdraw inward. They are still present physically, but emotionally they become quieter, more reserved, less expressive, not because they care less, but because they have less to give. And when this becomes a shared experience within a household, emotional exhaustion starts to define the atmosphere of the home. Everyone is tired in their own way, but no one fully realizes that they are becoming tired together. This is where the most subtle shift happens. Families do not break apart suddenly. They drift, slowly, quietly, without confrontation, without awareness. And in that drifting, silence begins to replace warmth. Not aggressive silence, not hostile silence, but neutral silence. The kind that fills space without emotion attached to it. The kind that no one questions because it feels harmless. But emotional relationships do not require harm to weaken. They weaken through absence of nourishment. There comes a stage where people in the same house begin to feel like they are managing separate lives under one roof. They coordinate schedules more than they share experiences. They exchange information more than they exchange feelings. They live parallel lives that occasionally intersect, but rarely truly meet. And the most unsettling part is that this can continue for years without being named. Because everything still appears functional. There is no obvious problem to fix, no clear moment that signals something is wrong. Yet inside, something essential has changed. A family that once laughed easily, now laughs less often. Conversations that once flowed naturally, now require effort. Even eye contact becomes less frequent, not out of avoidance, but out of habit. And because life is always moving forward, no one stops long enough to question when exactly things became this way. Modern life does not destroy family connection in loud ways. It replaces it quietly. It replaces conversation with updates, presence with proximity, attention with distraction, and emotional sharing with emotional endurance. And over time, people begin to mistake coexistence for connection. But emotional connection is not sustained by living in the same place. It is sustained by being mentally and emotionally available to each other. And when that availability slowly fades, even a fully functional home can start to feel emotionally empty without ever changing its structure. This is the silent distance modern families rarely notice while it is forming. Not because they do not care, but because they are too occupied to observe the shift happening in real time. Only later, when silence becomes too familiar to ignore, do they begin to realize that something essential was gradually left behind in the noise of everyday life. Chapter 6. The Silent Sacrifices of a Wife. There is a kind of strength that does not announce itself. It does not come with recognition, applause, or visible reward. It does not stand in front of people demanding attention. Instead, it moves quietly inside a home, inside everyday life, holding together things that would otherwise fall apart without anyone even realizing how close they were to breaking. This is the strength carried by many wives and mothers, the kind that rarely gets noticed while it is being used, but is deeply missed when it is absent. Her day often begins before anyone else wakes up. Not because she is required to, but because she knows what needs to be done. There is no pause button for household responsibilities. Meals must be prepared, routines must be managed, children must be guided, and emotional balance inside the home must be maintained. And while all of this happens, she often carries her own thoughts quietly in the background. Fatigue, stress, uncertainty, these are not always spoken out loud. Not because they are not real, but because expressing them might disturb the emotional stability of the people she is trying to protect. In many families, she becomes the invisible emotional manager of the household. She senses tension before it becomes conflict. She notices silence before it turns into distance. She understands when someone is overwhelmed, even when they pretend to be fine. And instead of adding her own weight to the home's emotional atmosphere, she often absorbs it. She takes on more than she shares, not because she has to, but because she feels responsible for keeping the family steady. This emotional labor is rarely recognized in words. It is not measured in salaries or achievements. It does not appear in formal records of contribution. But without it, many homes would feel very different. Because emotional stability in a family is not maintained only by financial support or physical presence. It is also maintained by emotional presence, the ability to sense, respond, and quietly adjust to the needs of others without making it a burden for them to notice. And yet, this effort often goes unseen. There are moments when she is tired, but still smiles so that the children feel safe. There are moments when she is worried, but still prepares meals so that the home feels normal. There are moments when she feels emotionally stretched, but still listens to everyone else's problems before addressing her own. This is not an act. It is not performance. It is a form of quiet commitment that becomes part of her identity over time. But what makes this sacrifice even deeper is that it is often done without expectation of recognition. She is not waiting to be praised for every small effort. She is not measuring her worth through acknowledgement. She is simply ensuring that life at home continues to function smoothly, even when internal pressure is high. And because she does this repeatedly, it starts to look effortless from the outside, even though it is anything but effortless. There is also a protective silence she maintains for the sake of the family. In difficult financial periods, emotional crises, or personal struggles, she often chooses to carry certain worries alone, not because she believes she can solve everything, but because she understands the emotional impact of stress on the household. She filters what others need to know and what they do not need to feel. In doing so, she becomes a buffer between hardship and the emotional well-being of the family. This kind of silence is not emptiness. It is protection. There is a powerful example of this quiet sacrifice that exists in many families. A wife may quietly sell something personal, perhaps jewelry she received on a special occasion, something tied to memory and sentiment during a time of financial difficulty. She does not make it a dramatic moment. She does not announce it as a sacrifice. She simply does what is necessary so that the family can continue moving forward without fear. The children do not feel the tension. The household continues functioning, and life, for everyone else, feels as normal as possible. But behind that normality, there is a decision that carried emotional weight no one else saw. This is what silent sacrifice often looks like. Not grand gestures, but quiet decisions that protect others from emotional burden. Over time, this pattern creates a deep emotional foundation within the family. Even when others are struggling, even when life becomes unpredictable, there is often one person who continues holding emotional continuity together. She becomes the one who remembers details, who maintains emotional balance during conflict, who absorbs stress when others are overwhelmed. And because this role is constant, it becomes invisible in its consistency. But invisibility does not mean lack of importance. In fact, it is often the opposite. The emotional strength required to do this daily is not small. It requires patience when there is frustration, calmness when there is chaos, and emotional endurance when personal energy is low. It requires the ability to keep giving without always receiving immediate emotional return. And while love is part of it, so is discipline of heart. The discipline to remain steady, even when life inside the home is not steady. There are also moments when she carries emotional loneliness within her own role. Not because she is unloved, but because much of her emotional energy is spent supporting others. And in that process, she may not always have space for her own emotional expression. Yet she continues, not out of obligation alone, but out of a deeper understanding that families survive not only through major decisions, but through countless small acts of care repeated over time. And slowly, without anyone naming it, she becomes the emotional center of the home. When a family looks stable from the outside, there is often someone quietly maintaining that stability from within. When children feel safe, when relationships feel intact, when home feels like home, there is usually a presence ensuring that emotional cracks do not turn into emotional collapse. But this truth is not always visible until reflection happens. It is only when people look back that they begin to see how many silent sacrifices were made on their behalf. How many difficult moments were softened before they reached them. How many stresses were absorbed so that life felt lighter than it actually was. And in that realization, something important becomes clear. The strength that holds a family together is not always loud. It is often quiet, consistent, and deeply human. And behind that strength, more often than not, stands a wife who chose to carry more than she ever spoke about, so that everyone else could carry less. Chapter 7. Children don't remember your salary. They remember your presence. There is a realization that does not come from books, advice, or lectures. It comes quietly, often later in life, when a person finally slows down enough to see what was happening right in front of them all along. For many fathers, this realization begins when they notice something simple but deeply unsettling. Their children are growing up in memories they were not fully part of. At first, it is easy to believe that providing for a family is the highest form of care. Working long hours, building financial stability, securing a better future, these actions feel meaningful, responsible, even admirable, and in many ways they are. But over time, something else begins to surface beneath that effort. A question that does not demand attention immediately, but grows louder in silence. What did the children actually experience while all of this was being built? Children do not measure love in salaries, promotions, or financial achievements. They do not understand the weight of responsibility that adults carry. What they understand is presence, attention, the feeling of being seen in the moment they are living. A child does not remember how expensive a gift was. They remember who sat beside them when they were excited, who listened when they were speaking, who laughed with them when nothing important was happening, but everything felt important in their world. And yet, in many homes, there is a quiet emotional gap that forms without intention. A father may be physically present, sitting in the same room, sharing the same space, but mentally absent, carried away by work stress, future plans, or unresolved responsibilities. To the outside world, he is fulfilling his role. But to the child, presence is not just about being there physically. It is about emotional availability. It is about attention that is not divided, even for a few moments. Children feel this difference, even if they cannot explain it. They notice when a parent nods but does not truly hear. They notice when eyes are on a phone instead of on their face. They notice when responses are automatic, rather than engaged. And slowly, without dramatic events, they adjust their expectations. They stop interrupting as much. They stop asking as often. Not because they need less love, but because they learn to seek attention elsewhere or within themselves. This is where emotional distance begins, not in conflict, but in adaptation. What many fathers realize only later is that childhood is not remembered in grand achievements or expensive milestones. It is remembered in fragments, a short walk together, a shared meal without distraction, a moment of laughter over something simple, sitting together without urgency. These small, ordinary experiences become emotional anchors that shape how a child feels about connection for the rest of their life. And when those moments are missing, something subtle forms inside a child. Not always visible, not always expressed, but deeply felt. A sense of emotional distance that does not necessarily mean lack of love, but lack of shared presence. There is often a moment of clarity that arrives years later. A father may find himself looking at his child, now older, more independent, and realizing that the version of childhood he thought he was building is not the same version his child remembers. The child's memories are not centered around financial sacrifice. They are centered around emotional availability, or the lack of it. This realization does not come with blame from the child. It comes with silence from memory, and in that silence, understanding grows. There is a powerful example that often reveals this truth in the simplest way. A son may not remember every expensive toy he received over the years. Those moments blur together, fade, lose emotional weight, but he remembers something else with clarity that time does not erase. A simple evening spent playing together, a moment where his father was fully present, laughing without distraction, not rushing, not thinking about work, just being there. That single memory carries more emotional significance than many material gifts combined, because presence creates emotional imprint, and emotional imprint becomes identity. As fathers begin to see this, something shifts internally. Success starts to feel different when viewed through the lens of emotional connection rather than financial achievement. The question changes. It is no longer only about what is being provided materially, but about what is being experienced emotionally within the family. And this is where the deeper understanding begins to form. Children do not need perfect parents. They do not need constant entertainment or constant attention. What they need most is consistency in presence. The feeling that when they reach out emotionally, someone is truly there, not partially there, not distracted, fully there, even in simple moments. Because what shapes a child's emotional security is not the size of the life provided, but the quality of connection inside it. And when that realization settles, it changes how a father sees time itself. Hours that were once sacrificed without thought begin to feel different in value. Moments that were once considered small begin to feel irreplaceable, because he begins to understand something that no amount of success can reverse. Emotional presence during childhood is not something that can be fully rebuilt later in life. It can be improved, it can be repaired, but it cannot be relived. And in that understanding, a quiet truth emerges. Children do not remember how hard you worked. They remember how present you were when it mattered most. Chapter 8. When wife and children become the purpose of life. There comes a point in life when ambition, once loud and commanding, begins to lose its emotional weight. Not because success stops mattering entirely, but because something deeper begins to surface beneath it. A man who once measured his worth through achievements, titles, income, and recognition, slowly starts to feel a quiet shift inside himself. The questions that once defined his direction, how much more can I earn, how far can I go, what else can I achieve, begin to fade in intensity. And in their place, something simpler but far more powerful begins to rise. Who am I doing all of this for? And what truly remains meaningful when everything else is stripped away? This realization does not arrive suddenly. It builds quietly through lived experience, through exhaustion that no success can fully remove, through moments of silence at home that feel heavier than the noise of the outside world, through the realization that milestones celebrated in public do not always translate into emotional fulfillment in private. And gradually, the center of gravity shifts. What once revolved around personal achievement begins to revolve around something more grounded, more human, more emotionally real. Wife and children stop being seen as part of life's background and begin to emerge as its emotional core, not as obligations, not as responsibilities in the abstract sense, but as living relationships that give meaning to every effort. The ambition that once felt like identity starts to feel like structure without warmth. And within that contrast, a deeper truth becomes visible. Achievement alone does not sustain emotional life. Connection does. It is often in moments of collapse, personal failure, financial struggle, emotional burnout, that this transformation becomes unavoidable. When external validation weakens, when the world becomes quieter, when the distractions of constant pursuit no longer occupy every thought, a man is left with what truly remains. And what remains is not the applause of society or the memory of professional success. What remains is the presence or absence of family. In that space, something unexpected begins to happen. Responsibility, which once felt heavy and demanding, begins to change shape. It no longer feels like pressure alone. It begins to feel like meaning. Providing for family is no longer just about obligation. It becomes an expression of love. Working for them is no longer just about duty. It becomes a reason to persist. Even exhaustion feels different when it is tied to someone you care about deeply, because love transforms burden into purpose. This is where emotional motivation becomes fundamentally different from ambition-driven motivation. Ambition pushes a person outward, always toward more success, more recognition, more achievement. But family pulls a person inward toward something stable, something grounding, something that does not change with external circumstances. When life becomes difficult, ambition can feel distant, but family remains close, even in silence, even in struggle, even in uncertainty. There is a subtle but powerful shift that happens when a man begins to see his wife and children not as part of his life, but as the reason behind it. Decisions begin to carry emotional depth that was not there before. Time becomes more intentional, attention becomes more meaningful. Even simple routines, eating together, talking at the end of the day, being present in small moments, start to feel like something valuable rather than ordinary. Because what he begins to understand is that emotional connection is not a reward for success. It is the foundation of a meaningful life, and in that understanding, a quiet reversal takes place. The life that once revolved around external validation slowly begins to revolve around internal connection. The urgency to impress the world starts to lose importance compared to the desire to be present for those who matter most at home. The question is no longer how successful can I become in the eyes of others, but how present can I be in the lives of the people who already see me as important. This is not a rejection of ambition. It is a redefinition of purpose. Because when wife and children become the center of meaning, responsibility no longer feels like something to escape from. It becomes something to live for. A difficult day at work no longer feels pointless when it is connected to providing stability for the family. A setback no longer feels like the end of everything when there are people at home who still depend on emotional presence more than external success. In this transformation, something very human is revealed. People are not sustained by achievement alone. They are sustained by emotional belonging. And belonging is not found in public recognition. It is found in private connection. There is also a deeper realization that begins to form over time. The happiest memories of life are rarely the loudest or most celebrated ones. They are often the simplest. An ordinary evening at home, a shared meal with laughter that required no special occasion. A quiet moment of togetherness that did not feel important at the time, but becomes invaluable in memory later. After surviving personal collapse, many people begin to see this clearly. A man who once chased success relentlessly may look back and realize that the moments that actually brought him peace were not the moments of achievement, but the moments of presence. Sitting with his wife without distraction, watching his children play without urgency, being part of ordinary life without the pressure of performance. These moments, once overlooked, become the emotional foundation of what he now recognizes as happiness. And this realization changes how he defines strength. Strength is no longer just about endurance in professional life or resilience in competition. It becomes about emotional consistency at home, about showing up when it matters, about being present even when life is difficult, about choosing connection over constant distraction. Because when everything else falls away, titles, roles, recognition, pressure, what remains is relationship, and within that relationship, meaning is rebuilt. Family does not eliminate hardship. It does not remove struggle or prevent failure, but it changes how those experiences are carried. It turns isolation into shared experience. It turns pressure into purpose. It turns survival into something that feels worth continuing. And slowly, the realization becomes undeniable. A life driven only by ambition may achieve much, but a life grounded in family carries something deeper. It carries emotional continuity. It carries belonging. It carries a reason that does not fade when circumstances change. In the end, what a man often discovers is not that success was meaningless, but that it was incomplete without connection. That all the effort, all the sacrifice, all the pursuit meant little if there was no one at home to share its reality with. And in that final understanding, wife and children are no longer seen as part of life's structure. They become the reason life itself continues to feel worth living. Chapter 9. The Dinner Table That Saved a Broken Man. There are moments in life when healing does not arrive in dramatic ways. It does not come through sudden transformation, or powerful speeches, or life-changing decisions made in a single instant. Sometimes, healing begins in the most ordinary places, in routines so familiar that they are often overlooked. A simple dinner table, a shared meal, a quiet evening where nothing extraordinary happens, yet something deeply human begins to rebuild itself without announcement. For a man who has carried emotional weight for too long, pressure from work, disappointment from failure, distance from family, and the internal silence that comes after everything feels too heavy, home does not always feel like comfort at first. It can feel like reflection, a place where thoughts that were suppressed during the day finally surface without distraction. In such a state, even sitting with family can feel different, not uncomfortable, but unfamiliar in a way that reveals how far emotional distance had quietly grown. But something begins to change when he sits at the dinner table again, not as a visitor lost in thought, not as a man carrying the world outside into the room, but as someone who slowly begins to re-enter the present moment. At first it feels small, a plate of food, the sound of utensils, a conversation starting without urgency. Nothing about it seems significant. Yet within this simplicity lies something that modern life often forgets to recognize. Emotional grounding does not always require complexity. Sometimes it only requires presence. At the beginning, his mind still drifts. It moves toward unfinished work, unresolved stress, and internal pressure that has become familiar over time. But slowly, without force, something in the environment begins to pull him back. A question from his child, a comment from his wife, a small moment of laughter that breaks the tension he did not realize he was holding. These are not grand emotional interventions. They are small human signals that remind him he is not alone in the space he occupies. And in those small moments, something begins to loosen inside him. Because brokenness does not always need to be fixed through action. Sometimes it needs to be softened through presence. And presence is exactly what begins to return in these ordinary family moments. No expectations, no performance, no need to prove anything, just shared space that exists without pressure. A space where emotional armor is not required. The dinner table becomes more than a place for eating. It becomes a place where emotional safety begins to rebuild itself slowly. Safety, not in the sense of avoiding problems, but in the sense of being able to exist without constantly carrying them alone. When a family sits together and speaks without tension, listens without judgment, and shares moments without distraction, something subtle but powerful happens. The nervous system begins to relax. The mind begins to slow down. And a person who has been operating in survival mode starts to remember what it feels like to simply be. There is a quiet healing that happens through ordinary conversations. Not deep philosophical discussions or emotional breakthroughs, but simple exchanges about the day, about small events, about nothing in particular. These conversations may seem insignificant from the outside, but they rebuild something essential inside a person who has been emotionally disconnected. They create continuity between inner life and outer life. They remind him that life is still happening in front of him, not just inside his thoughts. Over time, something even more important begins to emerge. Emotional presence becomes easier to access. At first he may sit at the table physically but remain mentally distant. But as days pass, he starts to notice details again. The way his child speaks, the expressions on their faces, the tone in his wife's voice. These details, once blurred by distraction, begin to return into focus. And with that return comes reconnection, not forced, not dramatic, but natural. This is where real healing begins to take shape, not in fixing everything that was broken in the past, but in restoring the ability to be present in the current moment without emotional overload. Because presence is not just physical proximity, it is emotional availability. It is the ability to listen without rushing, to respond without escaping, to sit without needing to leave mentally. A broken man does not always need answers. Often, he needs space where he is not required to be anything other than human. And the dinner table becomes exactly that space. It becomes a place where silence is not uncomfortable, but accepted, where conversation is not forced but natural, where emotional weight is not ignored but gently balanced by ordinary human connection. In such an environment, something slowly shifts in perception. Problems do not disappear, but they stop feeling like the entire definition of life. Stress does not vanish, but it becomes one part of existence rather than its center. There is a powerful realization that often comes quietly during these moments. Healing does not always require escape from life. Sometimes it requires re-entry into it, and family becomes that re-entry point. Because within family interaction, especially during shared routines like meals, there is a unique form of emotional grounding that cannot be replicated elsewhere. It is not about solving external problems, it is about restoring internal balance. It is about feeling part of something that continues even when personal strength feels low. It is about rediscovering emotional stability through simple shared presence. The broken man begins to understand something he had forgotten. He does not have to carry everything alone. Even without saying it directly, the presence of family communicates this truth. He is not required to be strong in every moment. He is allowed to be present, even when imperfect. He is allowed to sit, listen, participate, and exist without constantly performing resilience. And slowly, this changes how he sees himself. Not as someone defined only by struggle or responsibility, but as someone still capable of connection, still capable of laughter, still capable of being part of something emotionally alive. The dinner table, once just a routine, becomes a symbol of something deeper, a reminder that healing is not always loud. It is not always visible. Sometimes it is simply the return of attention to the present moment, shared with people who matter. And in that return, something broken does not just survive, it begins to feel whole again, not because life becomes perfect, but because it is no longer lived in emotional isolation. This is how small family moments become powerful healing forces. Not by changing everything at once, but by quietly restoring the ability to stay present in what is already there. And for a broken man, that presence becomes the first real step back toward himself. Chapter 10. When the world turns cold, home becomes shelter. There comes a stage in life when the world begins to feel different than it once did. Not necessarily more hostile in a dramatic sense, but colder in a quieter, more emotional way. People become more busy, more distant, more focused on their own survival and responsibilities. Conversations become shorter, relationships become more conditional, respect begins to depend more on status than sincerity, and slowly, without any single defining moment, life outside the home starts to feel less like a place of connection and more like a place of constant demand. In this world, everything seems to move faster than emotional understanding. Workplaces demand performance without pause. Society measures value through achievement, comparison, and visibility. Even relationships outside the family begin to carry subtle expectations: what you can offer, what you represent, what role you play in someone else's life. And over time, this creates an invisible exhaustion that does not come from physical effort alone, but from emotional overextension. A person can succeed in many areas and still feel internally drained, because success in the outside world often requires constant adaptation, constant effort, and constant emotional control. It is in this environment that home begins to take on a different meaning. At first, home is just a place, a structure, a routine, a space between work and sleep. But as the outside world grows more demanding, something shifts in perception. Home slowly transforms from being a location into something deeper, something emotional, something that does not require performance. And without fully realizing it, a person begins to associate home not with responsibility, but with relief. Because inside the home, the rules of the outside world no longer fully apply. There is no need to constantly prove worth. There is no need to compete for attention or validation. There is no need to maintain an image. At home, a person can exist without explanation, and in a world that increasingly demands explanation for everything, this becomes deeply valuable. But this realization does not come immediately. It often arrives after experiencing enough of the outside world to feel its weight, after enough pressure, enough comparison, enough emotional fatigue from constantly being on. Only then does the simplicity of home begin to feel like something rare. A door closes behind you and something changes, not in the physical environment, but in the emotional atmosphere. The noise of the outside world fades, the pressure to perform reduces, and for a moment there is a sense of pause that is not available anywhere else. Even if problems still exist, even if responsibilities still wait, the emotional intensity softens. Home does not remove difficulties, but it changes how those difficulties feel. And over time this becomes clearer. Success can bring comfort, but it cannot always bring peace. Achievement can bring recognition, but not always emotional safety. The world can offer progress, but not always belonging. And belonging is something the human mind begins to value more deeply as life experience grows. When a person is younger, they often believe strength is measured by how much they can handle alone. Independence feels like pride. Self-reliance feels like power. But as life continues, experience reshapes that understanding. Strength is no longer only about endurance. It becomes about emotional grounding, about having a place where the mind can rest without defense, about being able to exist without constant evaluation. And that is where home becomes something more than shelter from weather or space. It becomes shelter from emotional exhaustion. Inside a loving home, even silence feels different. It is not the silence of distance or absence. It is the silence of comfort. The silence where presence is enough without constant interaction. The silence where people do not feel the need to fill every moment with activity or distraction. In such a space, a person begins to recover parts of themselves that were constantly being used elsewhere in the world. Emotional security, once experienced, begins to matter more than external success. Because emotional insecurity is not always loud, it is often subtle. It is the feeling of not knowing how you will be received, the feeling of needing to adjust yourself depending on where you are, the feeling of being partially understood but not fully accepted. Over time, this creates internal fatigue that success alone cannot fix. But home, when it carries warmth, changes this equation. It becomes a place where emotional expectations are not conditional on performance, where presence is valued more than productivity, where a person can be tired without being judged for it, where they can be quiet without being questioned, where they can be themselves without needing to constantly explain or justify. And this is why, with age and experience, the meaning of home deepens. What once felt ordinary begins to feel essential. There is also a realization that grows slowly but powerfully. The world will always continue moving, regardless of how much effort one gives. There will always be more competition, more demands, more comparisons, more expectations. But home remains the one place where a person can step out of that cycle, even briefly, and return to something emotionally stable. This does not mean the world is meaningless. It simply means the world is incomplete without a place of return. And that place of return is what family often becomes. Because when the world turns cold, not in temperature, but in emotional tone, home becomes warmth that does not depend on conditions. It does not require achievement. It does not require status. It does not require explanation. It simply exists as a space where emotional belonging is still possible, and belonging is one of the deepest needs of human life. Not just to be seen, but to be accepted. Not just to be acknowledged, but to be understood. Not just to be present, but to be emotionally safe while being present. As life progresses, many begin to understand that protection is not only physical, it is emotional. It is the feeling that even when everything outside feels uncertain, there is still a place where you are not alone in facing it, a place where your existence is not questioned, a place where you are not reduced to your failures or defined only by your achievements. Home, when it is shaped by love, becomes that place, and family becomes the structure that holds it together, because family is not just about shared history or shared responsibility. It is about shared emotional space. It is about people who remain connected even when the world outside becomes disconnected. It is about continuity when everything else feels temporary. It is about knowing that no matter how cold the world becomes, there is still somewhere that holds warmth without requiring anything in return. In the end, this is what many come to realize after experiencing enough of life's pressures, achievements, losses, and transitions. The world teaches ambition, but family teaches belonging. The world teaches competition, but family teaches connection. The world measures success in numbers and recognition, but family measures life in presence, memory, and emotional truth. And when everything outside begins to feel uncertain, demanding, and emotionally distant, it is not achievement that brings true grounding. It is home. Because home is where the world stops asking you to become something else and allows you finally to simply be. And in that simple state of being, a deeper truth becomes clear. When everything else falls apart, it is not success that remains, it is family. And in family, humanity finds its deepest form of protection, its most honest form of belonging, and its quietest form of peace. There is a quiet truth that life reveals only after you have walked through enough of it. Careers change, money comes and goes, status rises and falls. The things that once felt permanent often turn out to be temporary. What seemed stable in one chapter of life can disappear in the next without warning. And when that happens, what remains is not the applause of the world, not the recognition of achievements, but the people who were there long before success ever arrived. Family is often the only constant that does not ask you to prove your worth repeatedly. It does not measure your value by your productivity or your position. It remembers you in a different way, through shared moments, simple conversations, and the quiet presence of everyday life. As time passes, what begins to matter most are not the titles earned or the goals completed, but the memories created with the people closest to you. These are the moments that do not lose value. In fact, they become more meaningful with time. A simple dinner, a shared laugh, a moment of being present without distraction. These are the memories that stay when everything else fades. And somewhere along the way, a realization begins to settle in. Presence is more important than perfection. Being there is more powerful than being impressive. Love expressed in ordinary moments carries more weight than success displayed in extraordinary ones. Many people only understand this when it feels late, when time has already been spent and moments cannot be revisited. But life always offers a reminder. What truly matters is not how much you achieved in the eyes of the world, but how deeply you were present in the lives of the people who mattered most. Because in the end, when life becomes uncertain, when the world feels heavy, and when everything else loses its clarity, there is always one place people return to: family. And in that return, everything important is remembered again: love, connection, and the quiet truth that beyond everything else, family is what remains.